Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in just a moment. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in just a moment. Thanks for joining. We're going to get started in just a minute.
Thank you, Brooke, and welcome everybody to this afternoon's FutureEd webinar on closing the attendance gap. My name is Thomas Toch. I am FutureEd's director and I'm moderator of this afternoon's conversation. With coronavirus vaccinations rising, COVID cases falling, and schools reopening, education leaders, as you know, are eager to expand learning opportunities. But strikingly high rates of student absenteeism threaten that work. A new FutureEd study drawing on an analysis by California-based Everyday Labs reports that absenteeism has been far higher than has been reported. Left unchecked, the problem threatens to derail efforts to help students make up for lost instructional time during the pandemic and to severely reduce the impact of the $190 billion federal investment in COVID recovery in the education sector during the past year. We are very pleased to have an expert panel with us to share the results of the study, examine the causes and consequences of the attendance crisis, and discuss smart strategies for using federal COVID relief aid to address the rising tide of student absenteeism. Emily Bailard is Chief Executive of Everyday Labs. Hedy Chang is Executive Director of Attendance Works, a San Francisco-based organization that works to improve school attendance. Phyllis Jordan is the author of the new federal FutureEd report, Present Danger, and is FutureEd's editorial director. And Charlene Russell-Tucker is the acting Connecticut Commissioner of Education, her predecessor having decamped to Washington, D.C. The panel is going to spend the first half of the hour discussing the attendance crisis and its solutions, and then we'll turn to audience questions. Please write your questions in the Q&A box in the bottom navigation on your page, and we'll get to as many as we can. Phyllis, let me start with you. The new report includes a detailed analysis of absenteeism during the pandemic in 5 major urban school districts serving nearly 450,000 students in the South, Southwest, and West. Tell us about the major findings, if you would.
Sure, thanks, Tom. Well, Everyday Labs shared this data with us from the 5 school districts, and there were some trends that really jumped out. Some of them surprising, some of them sort of expected. One of the more prominent things we saw was how much school kids were missing. It's not just that more students are chronically absent, missing 10% of the school year. There are more and more students missing 50% of the school year, just 80 or 90 days. It's a level of absenteeism that teachers aren't really prepared to deal with, and there's going to be some real different solutions we need for those kids. Another trend was that younger students are seeing higher rates of chronic absenteeism. Typically, high school students have higher levels of absenteeism, and that persists mostly, but the rates are growing faster among younger students, and sometimes in grades that we usually don't see much absenteeism, like 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade. Disadvantaged students in every district and every other study we've seen are more hard hit by absenteeism. This is true about the pandemic in general, but it really showed up in the absenteeism numbers. There was one district in the Everyday Labs study where low-income students saw their chronic absenteeism rates grow 12 percentage points, where other kids only grew 1 percentage point. There were racial and ethnic differences too. In one school district, Black students saw their rate of chronic absenteeism grow 19 percentage points, while for white students, it went down 1 percentage point. So this is really exacerbating attendance gaps and ultimately achievement gaps. Another trend, enrollment. This has been reported a lot, but every single one of these districts had drops in enrollment, and the biggest drops were in pre-K, K, and 1st grade, which is going to have some issues, pedagogical and logistical, going forward. And finally, and this is the really weird trend, there was an increase in perfect attendance. But, and I'll let Hedy talk more about this, rather than be good news, wow, perfect attendance, we really feel like the definition of attendance was so fluid during this pandemic period that the way we marked, teachers were marking absences led to, or counting attendance led to more kids appearing to be chronically absent. This could be an issue for schools who don't really realize these kids need extra support.
Thanks. Emily, your team did the analysis. What were the most striking findings for you and your colleagues?
Yeah, I think Phyllis really hit upon them. I think the 2 most striking and concerning findings for us was the growing inequity that we saw in the attendance gap with students who were living in poverty, English language learners, and students with disabilities missing far more schools than their peers this year. And then the other really concerning finding was that the increase in students missing more than half of school days. And it was, in some districts, it was 2% of students missing half of school days. In other districts, it was 7% of students missing half of school days. And those are just, incredibly large numbers. And how we saw that translate into the experience of the districts we partner with across the country was that it was, school site teams were stretched really thin, and it was really hard for them to balance the need to provide intensive supports to families and students that were experiencing those incredibly high levels of absenteeism, with also the need to do the prevention work and the work that's so critical for the other 95% of students. So that was really, really concerning to us this year.
Yeah. Charlene, Connecticut has worked hard to get a picture of its attendance challenge statewide. Our study that we did with Everyday Labs focused on 5 urban districts, but you have tried to capture clearly the attendance picture across Connecticut. What have you done to ensure that the state is getting the most up-to-date local data in recent months, and what trends have you seen there?
Thanks, Tom. And first, thank you for the invitation to be here to share Connecticut's story and to join all of you here on the panel. So in Connecticut, I think it's important to frame our story because we have a long history of really taking a data-driven approach to monitoring and addressing attendance and specifically addressing chronic absence. So based on that infrastructure, we really recognized early with the pandemic that this is an area we also needed just to lean in more on. It needed more focused attention. So in the fall, we stood up new data collection system, collecting information weekly on the learning models that were being implemented in our district statewide and also in attendance rates. And so we could calculate chronic absence. So if you go to our website, we have an interactive map that the public can engage with to get a sense of what the data are that we're gathering. So this frequent student level attendance data that we've been collecting is allowing us to better, I like to call it in real time, identify what issues, strategies we need to employ and how we support our districts. They also have that information as well. So being proactive has allowed us to really work with our educators or families or community partners to address and to try to learn our root causes and to address that. So overall, students with high needs tend to be more fully remote at greater rates than their peers. And furthermore, all student groups exhibit lower attendance rates on remote days than in-person days. And this is a pattern that is most acute amongst our students with highest needs, as Emily talked about. So that's really important information for us to have as we're looking at not only what attendance looks like, but connecting it to the learning model. So that's something that we've learned. And of course, we've disaggregated the data. So we can look at the data, we recognize our students who are experiencing homelessness, right? Or students or students with disabilities, and with the high need factors really just impact severely the attendance rate. So those are kind of the high level findings that we have, but just having that information, as you can well imagine, allows you to really be so much more data informed. And we'll talk about later, so what, right? Now that we have the information, what do we do about it?
Right, fair enough, thanks. Really interesting. Hedy, you work nationally. Any other insights that you can share?
Well, what I would say, first of all, is we have these sort of spotty pictures from different places. Connecticut as a state, the 5 districts that were looked at here, Ohio, but all the preliminary data suggests we are seeing a dramatic increase. Connecticut's was 12 to 20%. You might be seeing that kind of increase nationwide. We had 1 out of 6 kids chronically absent. We're going close to 1 out of 3. I do worry that some of the data that we'll see in states may actually be undercounts. This goes back to Phyllis's comment that there was more, quote, perfect attendance. Connecticut said it's chronic absence, defined a day of attendance as being there half a day. Most other places adopted a much wider range. It could be a two-way text between a teacher and a student, or a kid logged on for a couple minutes, and that still counted as being there. And it's almost that we used to use attendance in person for both checking in on kid well-being and as a measure of exposure to instruction. When you just check in for a moment, they're alive, but it doesn't count for exposure to instruction. So I think the challenge is we're seeing, we're probably underestimating the amount of learning loss, but certainly this notion that Phyllis also mentioned, that the pandemic is exacerbating existing inequities. And I will also say one other trend I would really want people to look at, in addition to looking at modes of learning, but look at grades. There are certain grades that we're seeing real challenges. Certainly kindergarten is a challenge and always has been, but for example, I'm seeing 9th grade coming up a lot. And I worry because if kids were in distance learning, these are kids, we know 9th grade is a critical year. It is an essential year for doing graduation. And if we lose our kids and don't pay more attention to them, we're gonna have a dropout crisis in the next year or two. And so this is why having access to this data, looking at it carefully, is so essential, because it needs we need to be informed by this data about where we really allocate our resources and our engagement strategies.
What are we, thank you. What are we seeing on the enrollment side of the equation? Obviously, attendance is a continuum. You miss a couple of days. We've been talking about the increased number of students who miss half the school year. What about those who just haven't shown up? What's the enrollment picture over the last year?
I think estimates are there's starting to be estimates across states. I know in California, we lost 160,000 kids, with about 60,000 of them being from kindergarten.
Right.
So certainly in kindergarten. And Charlene, how does that connect to what you saw in Connecticut?
We're very similar, Hedy, looking at the public pre-kindergarten enrollment and the kindergarten enrollment. And so really, certainly concerned, more than 50% decline when you add those together. And, so it begs the question as to why, and to ask, and then what do we do about it as well? We've worked closely here with our Office of Early Childhood around some of this, like how do we work together addressing it, but clearly it's there, and we have to really be focused on what happened and how to work to, I'm going to say, locate the kids to reconnect them to learning.
Yeah, let's come back to that. Let's just, did you want to jump in, Phyllis? You're muted.
I was just going to add that it seems like a logistical challenge for you, Charlene, and for if you have, theoretically, some of these kids will come back, and that you'll have 4-year-olds who want to go to kindergarten, 7-year-olds who want to go to kindergarten, and kids who want to go to kindergarten who don't have any pre-K experience. It just seems like a real challenge.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk a minute about the causes of these acute increases in chronic absence. Anybody want to take a shot at that?
I can talk a little bit about what we've seen. So we, as Phyllis mentioned, we work with districts, not just the 5 in the report, but districts nationally. And we spent the year surveying families and asking them questions about what barriers they're experiencing. And what we found was that in addition to the types of barriers that, families might experience in a normal year, we heard, all about all the challenges that families have been facing this year more generally, and that really showed up in their ability to go to school. So we received, thousands and thousands of inquiries about, finding food, finding meals, finding housing. Another thing was that more than 50% of families we surveyed mentioned at least at one point in the year that they faced a technology barrier. And most commonly that was about internet connectivity. So, sometimes it was having reliable internet, sometimes it was having access to internet at all, but that was a large barrier. And then we also heard more than normal about sickness as a barrier and family emergencies as a barrier.
Did they specify what kind of family emergencies? Obviously, COVID was looming large. Was it health related, or did they not specify?
We would get comments that kind of ran the gamut, and I think really what we saw was that attendance is not a bubble and does not exist in a silo. And so the, hardships and challenges that families are facing, were really showing up. We also saw in districts that had a combination of in-person learning and remote learning that were following a hybrid model, we also saw that the schedule itself presented a barrier to learning. Where on days, especially in a model where maybe 4 days a week, a student would be in school with a consistent schedule, and then 1 day a week, it was remote or asynchronous learning, that 1 day a week was the day a week that absences would spike. So that consistency of schedule was really important.
Interesting. Charlene and Hedy, what have you been seeing that you can point to for the causes of of these spikes. Obviously the pandemic has been a huge factor, but can you take us a little bit below the surface?
Sure, and so I'll add to all of the issues that Emily talked about, but I also, I'd like to just hold for us the economic barriers. We've learned about, especially older kids who went to work to support the family. And so when you think about that, or the issue of childcare. And so just recently we had students, a report by students to our state board, and one presenter was talking about having to take care of younger siblings. And so was not unable to be as connected as he needed to be. And certainly the issues of stress and trauma and overall well-being. But I cannot, express enough though, the importance to know that, because the solutions that we're working on will vary. And going back to what Emily said about not being in a silo, this economic solution is not necessarily one that the school alone can try to mitigate, right? To mitigate. So it's so important for us to know these issues because it will take broader approaches and cross-sector collaboration in order to really address those issues and to make sure that our families can thrive and our kids in turn, right, can be focused on learning.
That's great. Hedy?
Yeah, I think, especially because we have such large numbers of students who are either chronically absent or disenrolled, that we're going to have to take a kind of population approach. This isn't going to be individual case management because we won't have it will be hard to do. It's about understanding the causes and then the potential solution for different populations. So for example, there's a whole bunch of kindergartners who I think when you talk to their families, they didn't show up that last year. They had challenges because their families couldn't navigate the technology, especially if they were English language learners, or their families didn't trust in-person school and they had adult, older family members who they're worried about kids contracting the disease and COVID and bringing it home. There's kids who next year, as we come in, will have had this very large amount of time without ever being in formal setting and being around other kids. But that's very different from the older kids, like the 9th grader, who is challenged because they're trying to, maybe they lost a family member. I mean, we also know it's the populations hardest hit by COVID that have the highest levels of chronic absence. So these are families who are struggling economically, and young kids may in fact both have been required to work, but I would also say we were challenged because kids come to school. Okay, if you can address the connectivity and if you can also address some of the housing, health issues that are kind of the community issues, once you have those addressed, the question is, do you have positive conditions for learning in school? Do kids feel socially and emotionally healthy and safe? Do kids feel a sense of belonging, connection, support? Do kids feel that the curriculum they're around is engaging and relevant? Do they feel surrounded by adults and students? And I actually think it was very hard for us to replicate those positive conditions for learning in virtual distance learning. We, had a year to equip everything. We didn't have a year. We had like 3 weeks to equip everyone to start up the school year. And this is part of the reason why I think we have all these 9th graders who we didn't have the supports that would normally bring them into high school. So we have to look at, when you have high levels of chronic absence, it's an indication that one or more of those positive conditions for learning don't exist, and we have to put them back in place.
Yeah. Before we get to solutions, which we've begun to touch on a little bit and where we want to spend a good deal of time, I just want to put on the record, or have you put on the record, what the consequences of these devastating levels of student absence are for the educational success of students and schools more broadly. Charlene, could you take a shot at that?
Sure. So, if you go back just like the concept of lost instructional time, right? We've always said when we talked about attendance, if you're not present, right? Well, there's a big precursor, right? Attendance is that precursor to engagement, and engagement is a precursor to learning, right? And so if you're not there, it's just not going to happen. So there certainly are the lost learning opportunities and overall, right, reduction in outcomes, just in general. high level. In Connecticut, we happen to be finishing up our assessment. So we're literally doing an assessment, and we'll have data to inform us of how our students did, or the impacts, and then how to think about investing our resources to support them. But that, to me, in kind of in a nutshell, is lost instructional time, lost learning, and then we can go through all the outcomes of not graduating, dropouts, all those kinds of things that we know is not what we're trying to do, and we're trying to turn that tide.
Right. Great. Thank you. So, all right, let's talk about the other side of the equation. We've got billions of dollars in federal COVID relief aid working its way to states and districts. How can policymakers best use that money to address absenteeism? And Charlene, why don't we start again with you? What are you doing in Connecticut?
Well, we're doing a lot, and thanks for having us to talk about the money. But it truly is strategic investments, not only at the local, the district level, but also at the state level. And how do we make sure we do that also, not only in education, but across sectors? And I'll just give you some examples. So we have, our governor invested over $10 million in a new program, is a learner engagement and attendance program that we can literally put supports on the ground in districts using the data, by the way, that was allowed us to be data informed, that we can literally have folks who are able to go knock on doors if necessary, to reconnect, to connect with families, find out what the needs are. And again, some of those needs may be education, some of them may be social service needs, but how do you make those connections? We've been thrilled in Connecticut to really address the issue of devices and connectivity. And students who needed a device had it. We worked on connectivity as well. However, are based on scheduling and everything else, are they utilizing the technology the way they should? Is the connection the way it should be? And so to be able to problem solve at that level directly, critically important. But this learner engagement program is just on top of all the other programming and supports that we've had in place, again, for a while, so we're building on that. So devices and connectivity, really critically important. Putting supports on the ground, working with our districts, also very important. And that funding, again, at the state level, and also making sure that we're supporting districts so the resources that they have locally can also be appropriately deployed. And we're really thrilled to see in Connecticut, not only the new funding, which folks are still working the program, but the ESSER $2, we're looking at the bright spots and practices where districts themselves are planning re-engagement programs, attendance support programs with families at the local level. So really it is across the system. State, where can you invest? And districts, where can you invest really to support our students and make sure they're connected? I'll also add, we've invested our new dollars into summer enrichment programs and wanted to make sure that we're using the opportunity in the summer for that engagement and connection as well. So students who are disengaged can be connected through enhancement programs and enrichment programs so that they can be ready, right? We can get them ready to go back in the fall.
Great, thank you. One quick question. On your $10 million state outreach plan, who's doing the door knocking? Are these teachers? Are they aides? Are they retired teachers? Are they volunteers?
Great question, and varies based on the community, because you've got to work with trusted partners, right? To do that, to knock on doors. So we have districts that may be working with United Ways and other community organizations that's already embedded in communities in order to do that work.
Great, thanks. Emily, what do you see as promising strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to start with, which I think for this group goes without saying, but is prioritizing attendance. I know the districts we partner with know that improving attendance is one of the most fundamental ways to support learning recovery and to get students back on track academically. And so I think that's very much the first step, is making sure that that's a core part of your learning recovery plan. Then when we think about what the best investments are, the things that we come back to over and over again is that the best investments meet 4 criteria. Number one, it needs to reach students and families that you're trying to support. And that's something that we sometimes take for granted. And one thing that we've seen during the pandemic is that communicating with families and reaching them can sometimes be very challenging, which is why strategies like door knocking are so important. Strategies like phone banking are important, and strategies like paper mail is important as well, and making those really accessible. So number one, reach. Number two, strategies really need to be multi-tiered to balance both supporting the families and students who have really deep needs with also prevention strategies that can support all students and families. Three, strategies that don't burden teachers and school site staff. So to do as much as you can that doesn't burden school sites, because especially, this has been true this year and it's going to be true next year too, school site staff and school leaders and teachers are stretched so thin that taking as much off their plate as possible and doing as many strategies that involve, for example, Charlene's example of partnering with the United Way to enable, door knocking to happen without it needing to be teachers who are the ones knocking on the doors. And then finally, looking for solutions that are effective, that are research-based with a high level of evidence to support efficacy, I think is really important when we're talking about spending the amount of money and the amount of resources that we're talking about. And so, we always come back to the strategies that are in the FutureEd attendance playbook. Is a really great resource, and we're always really proud of the fact that the work that we do meets the strong evidence level set by
Tell us a
SIM.
little bit about Everyday Labs sort of model of using nudges primarily.
Yeah, so especially when we think about next year, kind of the goals that we're focused on is number one, focusing on week one attendance and also enrollment. And a really big part of this is communicating with those hard to reach families. And so using communication methods like mail and like phone calls and texting are really strategies that we rely really heavily on to be able to reach, large volumes of people. And then also, communicating in the family's home language, communicating at a level that is adjusted for literacy, really trying to communicate at a 4th grade reading level or below to make everything really accessible and short. Families are really busy. We're all busy and overwhelmed. So let's make things as simple as possible. And then to think about a steady drumbeat of supporting attendance and supporting rebuilding strong attendance habits throughout the year. And so relying on automated prevention tools. So the nudges that we send are really designed around equipping and empowering families with information about their students' attendance and working to make attendance and going to school safe, normal, and expected. And creating that feeling and using the power of social norms and behavioral science to, help families understand that attendance is safe, normal, and expected, and really kind of having that be a drumbeat throughout the year.
Great, thanks. Phyllis, you laid out a number of evidence-based strategies in your report. Can you share a couple of those?
Sure. Yeah, and as you all probably know, the American Rescue Plan, the big COVID spending plan, calls for 20% of the money the districts spend to be used on evidence-based practices and 5% of the state money. So it's really important to find evidence-based practices. And what Emily just laid out with the nudges and Charlene's home visiting approach, those are both evidence-based practices. But there's plenty of evidence-based practices that, take tutoring, for instance, which has a ton of evidence of improving academic achievement, but it also builds a caring relationship with an adult at school, and that has impacts for attendance as well. So there's a lot of things you can do in your effort to address learning loss that will also help with attendance. Another sort of set of category, this is what Hedy was talking about with school climate, and also Emily making it safe and normal and welcoming. There are, for kids to want to come to school, it's going to have to be a good environment. And given the trauma that a lot of kids have suffered, it's going to have to be a calm environment. And teachers are going to have to be prepared for there to be behavioral outbursts, either because the kid is traumatized or because they haven't been in a classroom for a year and they've forgotten how to do it. So there's going to need to be training for teachers. There's going to be approaches to discipline, restorative approaches that don't penalize everybody who acts out. There's also, we touched on, Charlene was touching on community collaborations. There's also sort of organized ways of doing it. Community schools is an approach that brings a lot of service providers, and there's a coordinator at the school and brings a lot of services to the school building. And this is an approach that is specifically mentioned in the ARP. And, it requires money for coordinating, and for a coordinator, that's something you could spend money on. And there is evidence that improves attendance as well as achievement. There are collaborative efforts, these cradle to career sort of approaches that a lot of school districts are doing that can have attendance both as a metric as they go through the years and as a better attendance as a result. And also one of the things that the American Rescue Plan does is it puts $1 billion more, $1 billion boost toward AmeriCorps. And AmeriCorps provides a lot of young people and some old people who can really sort of boost a school's staff, so you could get short-term workers to do contact tracing or to be mentors or tutors. You could have a lot of leeway in that way.
That's really helpful. Hedy, I wanted to turn to you and get your insights on strategies, but in your answer or in your remarks, could you also touch on this, what seems to be a short-term need, what to do this summer, and then how to look beyond that or to the fall, and describe any sort of differences and approaches for those two timelines that you think are important?
Yeah, we actually have a Pathways to Engagement toolkit that talks about, we've sort of been moving right now through a phase which is about creating a sense of belonging in school for the kids who were there, but also for the prospective kids, to encourage the kids who aren't enrolled to enroll. This summer then is really about creating bridges to school, so that kids who haven't been around now have an opportunity to be in person in school, be around other kids, get back, practice the routine. The routine of showing up every day in another place actually takes time to develop. And now we've got it, because some kids who've never been in the routine and a bunch of kids who are quite out of that routine, figuring out, and who will do better if they establish strong relationships. I mean, this is part of what LEAP is doing, is trying to actually use community-based organizations, whether that's WISE or YWCAs or church groups or whoever's in a community, to build relationships and then connect them actually to teachers. Kids are going to have to get connected to the school staff. And by the fall, you need to create community at school. So, belonging in school, bridges to school, community at school is a way of thinking about that work. And then thinking about, how do you put in the sustainability? This is going to take a multi-year effort. It's not going to be like, we'll make it through the summer and all of a sudden, all these effects of COVID are going to have been resolved. That's just not the case. The challenges have been so deep. We're going to have to build this over time. And what I would say is, what we've seen really work is when it's not a solo endeavor, but you have a team at school sites that are supported by a leader, a school leader, who then helps make sure that that team is really, thinking about foundational supports that make sure every kid has a caring relationship to someone in a school. And then they use data to determine, Emily mentioned a tiered support, when some kids need more intensive engagement and supports. And Phyllis mentioned, for example, tutoring and mentoring. Some models of tutoring and mentoring do work well, not all. It's the intensive models that are more 4 and 5 days a week, because that's what builds relationship over time. Because ultimately, in order to make sure kids show up to school, you have to know why they aren't showing up in the first place. And kids and families don't always tell you, oh, I'm homeless. Oh, I'm struggling with X. You know, they have to trust you. They have to believe you care about them, that they have their best interests at heart. And then especially kids who've experienced a lot of trauma and challenge. And over time, they will reveal to you what's going on, and then you can find the solutions that will actually get them back to school. And the relationship itself can be a motivator for coming back to school. So we need to have teams, data, and relationships, and districts need to be charged with the responsibility of making sure every school has that in place, and to sufficient levels, especially for schools that are serving large numbers of kids in poverty, where they may need even more intensive supports because they have more kids who've experienced the challenges where they really need intensive supports and personal relationship building so that they can come back into school and feel comfortable and feel like this is a place that they'll thrive and have hope that this school is going to get them to a better future.
Right. That's great. Thank you very much. So let's go to some audience questions. There are lots. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Here's one that plays off of the reference earlier to disciplining students who are coming back with a variety of traumatic experiences over the last year. How can districts be sure they are implementing restorative solutions versus punitive ones? And whoever answers that, please define restorative briefly too. Charlene, you're smiling. You want to take a shot?
You know, I was going to jump in before to talk about the social emotional mental health needs of kids, not just our students, but our educators, and the need to make sure that we're doing that as well. And whether you call it attendance strategy, it's a well-being strategy that without that, we will also have other concerns, and making sure we're resourcing. In some cases, it's more support staff in buildings, or more connections with behavioral health partners, again, just to make sure that they're there. We've also taken a really restorative approach, using that terminology about school discipline here in Connecticut, and put some guidance out on that before. And because we were concerned when we went back to school, and folks are back to school, and have been back to school in some cases from the very beginning here in Connecticut, that issues around mask wearing or distancing was really going to get kids in trouble, you know, in buildings, because in a very punitive way, you've done something wrong, versus restorative that says, you know, kind of what rules or whatever were broken and how can we restore, you know, that relationship. And so we put some guidance out on that very early on, so we can address those issues, that they didn't become the issue of exclusionary discipline, really adding to the attendance issue. You know, I'll just add, Tom, you know, great ideas, but it is also, our school districts have so much and I had a front row seat to watch them become, you know, minor in epidemiology over the past year, and becoming contact tracers, and all of those kinds of things, that they also need a lot of support in this work, and the partners around them to support them as well. So that is really critically important that we're considering. And the role of a state agency like ours is to also build those relationships with our districts, and provide opportunities for them to learn from each other, which we've done here with communities of practice. It's great to hear what your partner district across the way may be doing, so you can learn from that as well. And they can do their own problem solving. And you know, even if you're taking research-based or evidence-based practices, how you actually deploy and implement that is really important. So learning from each other and having those relationships established are really important, and pleased to be able to do that at a state level here in Connecticut to support our districts locally, and provide the forum with experts like Attendance Works to be able to work with them in that space as well.
Great. So that's a perfect segue to another question, which is, how do you effectively identify and work with community partners?
I can jump in there again, because it is really so important. You need them at the table before you really need them, right? This is not going out to say, United Way, can you just come in here and do something for us? You know, and this all may have to be customized based on the partners that's in your area. that's in your community and building those relationships. So that has been a strategy. Cross-sector partnership is something that we try to model here, but also help districts to model. The good news is all these partners, including philanthropy, they want to come to the table. They really want to help. And so being able to garner that support. The plan that districts have to develop right now needs stakeholder input, authentic stakeholder input. Our state plan that we just delivered yesterday to USED had to have stakeholder input. The district plans for also need stakeholder input in states, so folks should know that. And so building those partnerships, if they don't already exist, really is worth bringing folks to the table. And you may have to do some education, right? It's an awareness of maybe what is attendance, what is chronic absence, and then talk about the different roles that they're able to play. But it is critically important as we move forward.
Yeah. Go ahead, Hedy.
I also think our work on partnerships needs to be informed by an understanding of what are the causes of kids missing school or not enrolling. So for example, if you believe that a huge cause is that students lack connections to meaningful mentoring kinds of relationships that are ongoing, you can then think about who are all the places and folks. There are church groups, there are peers who can actually, youth who can be mentors. If you so that's one kind of solution. Or maybe you think the issue is a transportation one. Or maybe you think some of the challenges are connected to connectivity, in which case it could be businesses. I think as you think about which copy and who might be most connected, for example, to families with kindergartners versus older kids who are maybe needing to work, those are really different types of folks, and their needs are different. And so I think you want to have some understanding of the populations most affected and what's driving their challenges of being in school. And then you bring that to the partnerships, both to inform them, but also help you to think about, here's the right partnerships that I want to recruit. One of the things I think about, like on COVID recovery, is if we know a lot of young people are needing to work in addition to being in school because they're helping to fill out their family incomes, then what are our internships with employers who can create meaningful career experiences, but that kids don't feel they have to choose between being in school and actually earning some income so they can contribute to their household. And that helps you think about, who are my partners?
Mm-hmm. A couple of questions about the ways in which school districts and states have effectively connected with other social or student serving agencies, be they housing, around housing, food security, and the like. Can you shed any more insight into that dimension of the response to absenteeism?
So I can start by sharing that, again, what happens at the state and what happens locally. And I like to think of what happens as a state as modeling the way for what could happen locally. And so the work that we're doing also involves our sister agencies. When we think about, something as behavioral health, right? It goes through public health, it goes through mental health and addiction services, children and families. And we have a construct here in Connecticut where we are indeed working together in that way. So when we think about housing, and think about the Department of Housing here, and then how does that trickle down to what happens locally on the ground, really important. And so it's what happens at the state level, but I think it also paves the way for what can happen locally as well, and helping our districts to make those connections with agencies. And I'm telling you, folks are willing to they really want to connect with their districts, maybe so much so that districts have to become really strategic as to how they coordinate those partnerships. But somebody mentioned, earlier, like Cradles to Career. There's a lot of these kind of United Way kinds of efforts that's happening locally. The faith community happening. One of the priorities that we've put in our ESSER 2 and also our ESSER is family and community connections, like really important. And how do you do that? How do you work with colleges and universities? How do you work with employers? To Hedy's point about resources and connecting to our older kids for meaningful experiences, we have an opportunity right now to use this moment to really think holistically about what all the supports are for our families, our communities, and the children to thrive, and to braid those resources across sectors in order to support this endeavor.
Phyllis, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I echo what Charlene said, but I really think the community schools model is an effective way to pull together a lot of organizations around the school. And in some cases, the community schools will offer adult learning classes or employment services or health services or dental, or there was one place in New York that was offering haircuts for the kids. You know, they figure out what the community and the children need, and they provide it at school, and they have a coordinated effort. This is a strategy that, as I said, it's mentioned specifically as something you could spend your COVID relief money on. The Biden's proposed education budget has a big increase for grants to support these schools. So it's a really good approach for districts to consider.
Great, thanks. So I'm hearing a lot of discussion that implies the value of good data, not only on who's absent and how often, but why, right? Because in order to appropriately target a individual student's need, you need to know whether he or she is not in school because of a health issue or a child care issue or food insecurity issue, et cetera, right? Are there examples, Hedy, and you've I think done some work on this, are there examples where there are districts are using data systems, or maybe even state level agencies are using data systems that allow educators and others to see across the landscape that is beyond the borders of the schoolhouse, as it were?
Well, I think there have been efforts at interagency data sharing, where, so for example, kids who are in the child welfare system, you actually create, this is something, a group called FutureEd, where they would know if a kid was in foster ed, they identified a champion for them that was both in the school, one of their family members, and in the child welfare system, and they all saw the data on what kids had, what was happening with them in attendance and academics. And in fact, then this is a pre-COVID example, and they actually improved their attendance. But I actually was thinking, I'm gonna actually pick on Charlene mostly because I've worked with her a lot. I thought that some of what Connecticut did to share data, so there's sharing of individual data, which you can, as long as you have confidentiality permissions. Then there's sharing of aggregate data. So you look at trends and you say, oh, I'm worried about this trend. How do we understand what's going on? What I saw in Connecticut is throughout the pandemic, they both brought in public health, but they also brought in their child welfare agency to compare what were the data trends. And I'm wondering, Charlene, if you might talk a little bit about how you did that and how that resulted in action. And you all were sharing real-time data as all of you were gathering and seeing it, whether it was COVID, health data, or in fact, whether kids were being even reported for child abuse. And I just wonder if you could share a little bit how you looked at that and what actions you all took.
Sure. Back to the concept of working with sister agencies, right? Especially when you're talking about who are the kids. I think Tanya talked about, we all have responsibility for the same group of children, right? So why not collaborate and share resources? And that was really important for us when you think about the issue of truancy or education neglect that needed to be reported. And our Department of Children and Families was really monitoring that data to see the trend there, because schools were not, right, we weren't having the same interactions with teachers and students in schools, and where the reporting was happening, what's happening there and how could we work together. And so that allowed us to do joint guidance for districts. We even did joint webinar. I know Hedy was a part of that, where we were talking about, this is, I'm going back to something Emily said. I wrote it down because we talk about our families been hard to reach. And I always like to say, somebody knows where they are. And so it's really important for us to be able to connect in that space. And so GCF was really helpful as we did work together and continue to work together in looking at data, sharing data, and making sure, number one, that we're also as a system not necessarily being punitive, but certainly as supporting and helping families. I think they developed kind of a warm line, where folks could come in and it wasn't going to trigger this big, big hand of the state, but to help folks to really think about what kind of supports do you need, because that also impacted and assisted with education as well. So really important for that level of sharing and collaboration to take place and working with our districts as a part of that triad, right? Of knowing what to do and how to support families.
And can I just say this, one quick on this one, was that what it avoided was you were seeing across the country, some places where families were calling child welfare, or a teacher is calling child welfare because a kid didn't have connectivity. And then if you bring in child welfare, at that point, you then create disengagement and distrust. So they work together to make sure that didn't happen, but also there was a place for teachers to go if they actually had serious concerns that something was happening in the household and they couldn't tell what was going on because they could only see the kid by Zoom.
Interesting. Emily.
Yeah, another thing that we that we did for our district partners that was kind of surprisingly simple and had a lot of benefits was establishing a district-wide phone number that you could chat, that you could text or call in order to navigate district support. So if you needed something, like a single phone number to call or text. We did it initially because we were hearing from parents that they were having a really hard time navigating, and the phone is only answered at the school certain hours of the day, and that doesn't necessarily align when as a parent when you need support. And oftentimes as a parent, if you go to a website, it's just really hard to navigate how to get the help that you need. One really nice benefit from this, though, was because it was one phone number, we were able to provide, weekly reporting to our district partners about what were the questions that were trending across the district so that they could see bigger patterns. So, for example, we could see where can I get a COVID test was trending, where can I find meals, when that there were more questions about schedule, when people were having login challenges, when people were having more device challenges, and really to surface that. And so it ended up working really well, and it gave us visibility as well, because over the course of the year, we had more than 85,000 parents nationwide contact us. So we were also able to kind of see some of those national trends.
Interesting. So we're almost at time, but I would like to ask you, in conclusion, sort of how sanguine you are about our ability to rebound from this problem. It's clear from the research we've seen, from what you've been saying, that we're facing a severe problem, especially for traditionally underserved student populations. But we are coming out of the pandemic, kids are getting back to school. Sort of how optimistic are you about our ability, in part with smart use of federal funding in the coming months, to sort of address this problem, make progress?
So I'll jump in to say I have reason to be hopeful for all the reasons that you've talked about, and the work that we've done, the interest of our broader community in wanting to be a part of the solution. Our districts who, despite all the work that they're doing, Emily talked about teachers, the work that they've done for us in Connecticut in being on the front lines of doing attendance in new and different ways. But it was important enough for them to be able to do that locally so we can have it. So I am hopeful that, back in, I think, 2016, Hedy, we did this report about what states can do. And I go back to the 6 high impact strategies, which every time I look at it, I think they really do still work. Building that awareness, using data to promote action, cultivating champions to build the state level infrastructure, build capacity, identify and leverage bright spots, and foster accountability. I really believe if we continue to do that with the right partners at the table, we can get this done. We've done so many other things in our nation. Wow, let's work together to make sure that we can get our kids back on track.
And I would say if we don't address this attendance issue, there's very little hope of turning around the other issues related to the pandemic. I mean, if you're going to get, you know, you're going to give kids tutoring, if you're going to give them extended day, if you're going to give them summer learning, none of these strategies work if you don't have kids showing up. So you need to address, why aren't kids showing up? You need to re-engage them. You need to help them overcome barriers, and you need to get them back to school or back to classroom.
Yeah, I mean, your suggestion, your collective suggestion also that this is not a one and done sort of situation where it was a problem before the pandemic, a serious problem. The pandemic only made it worse, and that it's now going to take some period of time, well beyond the first day of school next year, to address this issue with a very concerted effort across a lot of different strategies. I mean, that's what I've heard each of you say in different ways. So I think on that note, we should thank our panelists, Phyllis, Charlene, Hedy, and Emily, for really thoughtful insights on the problem and how to address it. We're fortunate to have all of you doing this good work on a crucial issue. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you to our audience for participating. We're grateful.
Great.
Thank you.
Take care.